Okay, so let's finish up by starting to talk about the limitations. The limitations of this particular study, or two studies, was that there were only 8 students who were participants, 4 in the first study, 4 in the second study. Also, the generalization of the effects from the interventions to classroom performance were not assessed, so we're not really sure if these interventions that were studied are going to be effective and be able to be generalized in a classroom setting, instead of with just isolation and one of the interventionists. So the studies were also conducted utilizing expert consultations, and the feasibility of other schools having access to this is questioned. And the studies were conducted to research math fluency for basic math operations, and it is not known whether it would generalize to more complex math skills. And finally, only one of the students in both of the studies was an identified special education student. So I'm not sure how the effects of this will transfer over to more of our special education population. However, Irene, our Doris, our special education student from this particular study, did really well in the intervention phases. So I'm going to hope that it would transfer over to all special education students, but again, that's just one of the limitations. So the evaluation of this study, what type of preparation would be needed to implement this strategy? I believe it's pretty easy to implement. The training of the instructors, giving the interventions would need to happen, and materials would need to be gathered. So for instance, we'd need to get together the cover, copy, compare materials, the CTD materials, and of course the rewards for the students during that reward condition. What type of training would be needed to implement with fidelity? Well, teachers implementing the intervention would need to be trained to score the CBM materials and practice agreements until it reached the designated 90%. Also, procedural techniques would need to be taught to the interventionists to ensure fidelity. What would a fair timeline be for implementation? I believe 2 weeks probably is fair assessment. After the initial identification of students, there's not really a whole lot of training that needs to be involved, but just enough that you would have to take time out of your plan time, your schedule. How do you think students would show academic improvement as a result of the implementation? This one was kind of hard because even through the limitations, it was noted, that this hasn't been tested as far as generalizing to classroom settings. And unless you're using the specific CBM materials that were used in here, you'd have to develop your own, or just use the improvement on their grade level assessments and their daily work, since it does deal with math facts. You'd be able to tell, those students who are getting a lot more fluent with their math facts. Would this be a valuable strategy to implement? I feel as though it would be very successful in helping to identify specific fluency interventions for our Tier 3 students. What would the timeline and cost be to implement this strategy in your classroom and your school? I believe that the only cost would be for the consultation of experts on how to begin implementation and the training of the teachers. The BEA process itself really has little cost to it because you use materials that are readily available. And my references are listed here on this page for my article.